So I'm very pleased to welcome you. I'm Abbot James Wiseman, the superior of the monastery here. This is our third annual symposium. I'm sorry to have interrupted the breakfast of some of you with bells. If you live in a monastery, you know you have to live with bells. I once read that, in fact, the whole clock orientation of our modern society goes back to St. Benedict. So for better or worse, we do have a tight schedule. This is an all too timely topic. We could spend days on it. We have, in fact, only this morning, so we're going to try to keep very tightly to the schedule that you see in the program there. This opening session will include brief presentations by our panelists, one of whom has not yet arrived. It might have something to do with traffic problems, but Dr. Subramanian, I hope, will eventually show up. Then after their opening presentations during this first session, there'll be a short break, probably just 10 minutes or so. And when we reassemble for the second session of the morning, there will be an opportunity for interchange, either among the panelists or with questions and comments by any of you in the audience. We'll try to conclude promptly by 11:55. And the reason is those who wish could then join with me walking up to the monastery Abbey Church for a brief midday prayer service. Usually lasts about 12 to 15 minutes, after which I would give a little tour of the monastery to those who'd like to see something of the Abbey itself, after which we then come back down here for lunch. Those of you who would not be going up to midday prayer could immediately have lunch in the commons area right where the breakfast was available. Those of our Muslim guests who would like to have one of their regular prayer services could use the room at the very top of the stairs here behind the theater. It's normally used as our Board of Trustees meeting room, and we've set that aside for our Muslim guests for one of their daily prayers. Now, something like this symposium can only come about with the help of many people, help from many sources. I first of all want to thank the members of our planning committee. That's including a couple of our panelists, Imam Muhammad Bashar Arafat and Bhante Katagostaga Uparatana. In addition to those members of our planning committee, I also want to thank John Feeney, Larry Ham, Laura Kennedy, Peter Kovac, and Michael Lemon. Something like this also needs not only planning of the program, but planning of facilities. Our director of facilities, Jose Morales, whom some of you have met out in the corridor, he and his assistant, Dennis Sisson, did heroic work yesterday setting up the whole space for our breakfast and the lunch afterwards. Peter Collins, one of our regular school faculty, and Michael McCarthy and one of our students, Nishant Kaur, are in charge of all of the audio-visual capabilities of the day. My longtime friend, David Stang, one of the members of our audience here, with a very generous gift, has helped cover the expenses of the catered breakfast that we just had. Our regular monastery cook, Regina Krieger, has been working very hard preparing the sandwiches and cookies that we'll have for lunch, assisted by one of our other cooks, Ronnie Scott. I thank all of them very sincerely. Needless to say, I thank all of the members of our panel, and perhaps most of all, our moderator, Dr. Shaun Casey of the Department of State, whose job it will be to keep things running smoothly and on time. At the break, I would simply like to ask Shaun and the panelists to go outside to the east end of this building for a still photograph, right at the beginning of the break. And as you might know, I conclude, the word symposium comes from a Greek term that means literally drinking together. And it referred most of all to the convivial parties that would usually conclude a banquet. Now, we don't have alcoholic beverages available here today, but I think in other respects, this is going to be a lively and convivial gathering. And having said all that, I'm going to sit back and listen to what the panelists have to say in this first session about what, in their perspective, are the main reasons why members of their particular religious tradition have at times gone to extreme interpretations, even to the extent of advocating violence.
Thank you so much, Abbott, and I too want to second your thanks to everyone who participated in the planning and conceiving of this conversation today. You put together a remarkable panel here, and we have a great audience. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for your interest, and thank you to the panel for your willingness to bring your expertise to this very, very important discussion. So you brought in a diplomat and an Irishman to sort of keep things running. That is my task this morning, is to sort of keep the trains running on time, and we'll see how effective I am in that. But essentially, as the abbot said, the first hour, we're looking at our panels to talk about the sort of the appearance of violence and conflict within their respective traditions. After the break, I'm going to pose some questions back to you based on what you have to say, and try to get some crosstalk across the traditions, and then as quickly as possible try to pivot to you for your questions. In my experience, having lived now in Washington for almost a little over 15, 16 years, excuse me, and having done lots of these kinds of panels, they tend to be really good when we pivot to the audience and we can put away our talking points and have to respond to your perspective and your questions. So the sooner we can do that in the second session, I think the better for all of us. We have an amazing array of expertise on the panel today. I'm not going to read all of their bios. You can look, I think in the program you see sort of what their titles are, and you can, I think, intuit from that what their different faith relations are. And so I want to get started as quickly as possible. We're going to simply follow the order of the panelists as they're listed in your program. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Imam Muhammad Bashar Arafat, a good friend, and I'm so delighted that you're here. So please kick us off and set the tone. And I'll give you sort of a 2-minute warning near the end of your 2 minutes. But thank you very much. And Imam, please.
Thank you very much. Well, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. May the peace and blessings of Almighty be with all of you. I just looked here and I saw that I'm going to be first. Normally I come last, but it's okay. This is really a very, very important topic because of what's going on around the world today. But I would like to share with you, first of all, from the Islamic perspective, what we read in the Quran about the issue of radicalization, or what we call extremism, or at-tatarruf, when you go a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, and how it is very important to go back to the middle. And it is wonderful to see the verses in the Quran addressing that issue, and especially when it comes to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself. So I would like just to start by saying that 3 groups of the disciples of the Prophet, they came to the mosque, and one of them said, when the Prophet dies and we die, we are going to be completely in a different place in heaven. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to marry women, and I'm going to be celibate all of my life. The second said, well, I'm going not to eat meat, and I'm going to forsake that for myself. The third said, well, I'm going to fast all of my life, which we call it Sawmud Dahr. The Prophet's room, Prophet Muhammad's room was adjacent to the mosque. So he came for the prayer and he said, who are those people who are trying to show that they are more religious than the Prophet himself? I am the Prophet of Allah, more righteous than all of you, but I do eat meat. Now, this has nothing to do with the vegetarians. I do eat meat, and I do marry women, and I do fast and break the fast. This is my sunnah, this is my path, and whoever deviates from my sunnah is not from my ummah, from my community. This is as far as going a little bit extreme in your worship. But even the Prophet himself, we read in the Quran that God will tell him, don't go a little bit to the extreme when you worship, even yourself. So there is a whole chapter in the Quran called Taha. This chapter starts with the beginning like this: Taha ma anzalna alayka al-Qur'ana litashqa. O Prophet, we did not reveal the Quran on you to overburden yourself and to hurt yourself, because he was praying sometimes the whole night. So go and have some time to sleep and rest. The other thing I would like also to mention, the Prophet himself sometimes will do certain things and the Quran advise him, no. This is not right. For example, when his uncle Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib radiallahu anhu, when he was killed and his body was mutilated badly by the wife of his main opponent, Abu Sufyan, and when the Prophet saw his body like that, he swore that he is going to kill in his place and take the revenge of 70 people of the pagans in Mecca. The Quran was revealed telling the Prophet, you cannot do that. وَإِنْ عَاقَبْتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا عُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ. If you were going to punish, you will punish exactly the same way you were punished. But وَلَئِنْ صَبَرْتُمْ لَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لِلصَّابِرِينَ. If you would be forgiving and you are patient, that is also even better. I really hope that sometimes here in the United States, people will go and see the verses in the Quran telling the Prophet in those areas why you did what you have done. You should have had done this or that. There is a long chapter in the Quran also called the frowning. It's called Abasa. The Prophet frowned in the face of somebody who came and he was asking question about Islam. But why he frowned? Because he was sitting with the people of Mecca, the pagans in Mecca, before he migrated, and he was busy talking to them. And this blind man came and he was asking questions. And the Prophet said, would you please go and come back, because I'm busy right now. The man insisted, no, I want the questions answered now. I want to learn. The Prophet got upset because the man kept insisting. He said, look, I have people here. Would you please go and come back? No, I want it now. Would you please go and come back? The man was hurt. Archangel Gabriel right away came down telling the Prophet, Abasa wa tawalla, you frowned in his face. That shows you, of course, the rest, almost 7 verses after this, reprimanding the Prophet, you don't do that again. If somebody is sincere and coming to you, you respond to him. That shows you that even the Prophet himself used to be corrected in the Quran, but sometimes with mild correction, with respect, and sometimes it's a little bit harsh, that you should not ever do something like that again. Who is going to correct the imams, the scholars, the Muslim community today, some of the groups, when they do certain things? Of course, it is what we call ijma'. Ijma' is one of the sources of Islamic law. But today, when you have ijma' and when you have consensus of the scholars saying that this is haram, forbidden in Islam, Islam does not condone this kind of act of violence or that act of violence, who is the one who is going to take this message to the rest of the world? Why the media is not interested in showing the whole people in the United States what those consensus of the scholars said in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, that this has nothing to do with Islam? This is today something really we have to think and keep in mind, that there are so many consensus today of the scholars asking the Muslims how to move forward, especially with this new age that we are living in right now. The other thing I would like just to mention in my 10 minutes, that when we talk about interfaith response, today, after what has been called, quote unquote, the Arab Spring, which a movement started, not even an organized movement, you will see the death of this Arab Spring. And what is the responsibility of Muslims in the United States to help those people in the Middle East, or those people in Africa or in Asia? What is the responsibility of Muslims in Europe? What is the interfaith community in the United States and the interfaith community in Europe should help also others how to have a better life when it comes to lack of democracy or other inequalities? And especially when I'm talking about other inequalities, I'm talking about the financial situations. So for example, there has been a report about the 1%. I don't know if some of you have seen the report issued by Swiss bank Credit Suisse in October 2015. It talks about something really so sad.
1 minute, Imam. I'm sorry to
It says, a new report finds that global wealth inequality continues to worsen and has reached a new milestone, with the top 1% of the world population owning more of the world's assets than the bottom 99% combined. Of the estimated 250 trillion in global assets, the top 1% owned almost exactly 50%, while the bottom 50% of humanity owned collectively less than 1%. The richest 10% owned 87.7% of the world's wealth, leaving 12.3% for the bottom 90% of the population.
Time. I'm sorry.
Please
finish, yes.
2 minutes, not one, right?
Just
okay.
take one.
I really would like to talk later on about also issues when you are talking about radicalization. There are certain things the Muslim community have to do when it comes to educating their own fellows. And then it is our responsibility, people here living in the United States. I had here something about our foreign policy, if sometimes drive some people crazy. And here I quoted certain things, and I wish that you will watch this when you go back home, about the C-SPAN that was airing October 27, clips of the U.S. strategy in the Middle East. Senator Lindsey Graham challenges Defense Secretary Ashton Carter and Joint Chiefs of Staff General Joseph Dunford of the U.S. strategy in Syria. He asks about the possibility of overthrowing Syrian President Assad. I wish I have time just to share with you also the responses. I don't know if some of you have seen this. I'm saying that because this piece today is translated in so many languages and shared over Facebook, telling the people, do you see something like that? I'm asked about those kind of things when I travel with the different embassies doing programs on public diplomacy and Islam in America. And the last thing I would like to mention here, also when it comes to the CVE, which is known in Washington about counter-violent extremist ideology, and the need for a new application is called CVE+. And that CVE+, when you add spirituality to CVE, the thing that the people in Washington are not used to that, when you change the interfaith movement from 101 to interfaith, 200 and 300 and 400. And that's when you add the spirituality component to that, and that's where I would love to talk later on about the experience of the Sultan and St. Francis. In the West, we always talk about St. Francis and the Sultan, but it's about time to talk about the Sultan and St. Francis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Imam. Now let's turn to Professor Eisen.
Okay. Everybody can hear me? All right, good. I understand my assignment is to talk about why Jews are prone to violence, and usually what that means nowadays is talking about religious extremism among Jews, particularly in the state of Israel. And so that's what I'm going to address. Now, the thing is, I have to tell you from the start here that I'm going to speak as an academic because, well, first up, because I'm an academic, but also because I think it's the best way to answer the question that I've been given in this forum. And what that means is that my explanation is going to delve into psychology and also into history. In other words, what I'm going to be talking about is the way Jewish psychology on violence was shaped by its history. Now, this may be off-putting to some of you because you might want me to speak more personally as a Jew, but actually, I think it's better for me to talk as an academic and to remove myself. I think this is something we all have to try to do. We have to remove ourselves from our own religious traditions and kind of look at ourselves objectively. And I spent a good amount of my time doing research on this material in all three Abrahamic religions with this perspective in mind. And so, what you'll be seeing here is a kind of intellectual out-of-body experience. It's like, me looking at myself, okay? So here we go. In order to answer this question about why any religion resorts to violence, you have to understand how the followers of that religion develop their religious identity. Now, Jews developed an unusually strong sense of religious identity in order to survive their history, which had many, many setbacks. And in order to understand this, you actually have to go all the way back to the beginning. Jewish history goes back, 1,000 years to 1,000 years BCE, 3,000 years of history. I'm fond of saying that Jews did well in the first 100 years in the time of King David and King Solomon, and then everything went downhill from there. And I'll run through just some of the, just give you some of the facts. Ancient Israel was in a strategic location that everybody wanted. All of the surrounding empires wanted that piece of land because of the way it kind of came together. It was in the center of where three continents roughly come together. And so, you have the Assyrians who come in and wreak havoc on the Jewish kingdom in the 8th century BCE, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. Over 1,000 years, you have one empire after another attacking, subjugating, and sometimes destroying the Jewish kingdom. And in fact, the Jewish kingdom was destroyed twice during that period. So you see, the only way that Jews were going to survive this was to believe that they were special. And so it's no surprise that Jews spoke of themselves as a chosen people, chosen by an all-powerful God who ruled the universe. And it's that belief that gave them the strength that they needed to deal with their difficult circumstances. Now, from a secular perspective, the fact that they survived, you might say, well, that was, as much of good luck as much as anything. But the Jews did not see it that way. They saw it as proof that they were part of some sort of divine plan and that God was on their side. Now, Jewish identity was so strong that even when Jews eventually were exiled from their land, they continued to believe that they'd return to their land. And that's actually very unusual in history because most people, certainly at that time, that lost their land, had their religious temple destroyed, they generally disappeared. But Jews had developed this very strong sense of identity. They felt that they were God's chosen, and they still felt that they still had a relationship with him. And they thought that they were going to return to their land. This was just, another rough spot in history. Now, the exile that I'm talking about happened in the 1st century when the Roman, I'm talking now CE, right? When the Romans destroyed the Jewish state, and Jews were really sent into exile for the next, 1,800 years. And you see, during those next centuries, Jews lived either in Christian Europe or in the lands conquered by Islam. Now, in Christian Europe, Jews did okay for the first few centuries, but eventually it became very harsh. And to cut a long story short, they eventually were ostracized politically, socially, economically, because they got a very bad rap, in Christian theology as those who had rejected Christ. And eventually there was mass violence against Jews. It begins primarily with the Crusades, where you have thousands of Jews massacred as the Crusaders marched across Europe. And over the next several centuries, hundreds of thousands of Jews would die in anti-Jewish violence in the Middle Ages. Now, Jews also lived under Islam, and life for Jews in the Islamic countries was a lot better. But contrary to what is often believed, it also wasn't great there either, because Jews, and you see this in Jewish literature, if you're familiar with Jewish literature in the Middle Ages, talk about their humiliation and the fact that they were always treated as second-class citizens. And here, too, there was violence over the centuries, never to the extent that it was in Christian lands, although there were a couple of wholesale massacres. In the 10th century Granada, 5,000 Jews were killed. But again, the important thing is that through all this time, Jews believed they would return to their homeland. And that would happen in the Messianic era when, God would send the Messiah, liberate the Jews, and destroy their enemies. And Jews would get their land back. But they also, very importantly, they would get back their dignity. And I think we always have to keep in mind that when we're talking about religious violence, we're not just talking about land, we're not just talking about material things, but dignity is very important for fomenting. The getting back dignity is a huge issue in causing religious violence. Now, in the 1800s, major changes occurred in Europe. And it gave the Jews hope for a much better life without having to return to their land. Jews were invited in the years of enlightenment and human rights democracy that came to Europe in the 19th century. They were invited into European society, and they did very well in European society. And so many Jews began to think, well, maybe we don't have to return to our land. And there was a conscious effort to kind of distance themselves. We're good Germans, we're good Frenchmen, etc. But by the late 1800s, the anti-Jewish hatred came back again. And there were a series of riots against Jews that broke out in Russia in that decade. And over the next 40 years, another 100,000 Jews would die in violence in Russia and in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine in particular. And this was all before the Holocaust, right? And then the Holocaust occurs and 6 million Jews die. Now look, it's against that background that you understand Zionism, because Zionism arose as Jews gave up on living peacefully in Europe. And many became convinced that the only way to live peacefully and with dignity was in their own homeland. And so a movement started. And to cut a very long story short, it was remarkably successful in the sense that they actually did create a state that, in 1947. Now, look, one thing that I want to emphasize here is it is very important to understand how far back Jewish suffering goes. There's much too much talk about the Holocaust, that this is the major event. But in fact, if you really want to understand why Jews are so touchy and why they are prone to violence, you have to understand that it's actually been ingrained in us from about, for 3,000 years, because Jews have rarely had long periods in which they've lived in any peace. Now, all of this goes a long way, I think, in explaining why Jews are prone to violence and extremism. Many of these Jews, and here I'm now talking about Jews who are in Israel, and even Jews who live here who support Israel, have violent instincts, and they're violent because of their religious beliefs. Because what they believe is that the return to the land of Israel, that's the beginning, that's us getting our land back, but it's also the beginning, very important, of the Messianic redemption. And that means that all Jews must return to all the lands that were promised by God to Abraham in the Bible, and that includes, of course, the West Bank. And of course, in order to do that nowadays, because there are a lot of Palestinians living there, it requires violence, and these Jews are willing to perpetrate violence. But also keep in mind that Jews here are motivated, and this includes the secular Jews, they're motivated by the desire to live in safety, which may be really the more important cause. And that's very difficult to do in Israel because, you have this tiny country that is no bigger than the size of New Jersey. People don't realize how tiny it is, surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who want to destroy it, and it has hundreds of thousands of missiles pointed at it at any one time. And no one can easily live under those circumstances and remain calm, but especially a people that's lived through the centuries as the Jews have. After 3,000 years of being attacked, subjugated, persecuted, Jews have this hair trigger mentality and lash out very easily at their enemies. They don't easily trust anyone. And the attitude basically is that, look, no one was ever there to help them, and no one is going to be there now. We have only ourselves to rely on. So the big challenge here is how to allay these fears, and that's really the issue when one is dealing with Jews. And I tell you, it won't be easy because of the depth of the fear that Jews feel. Now, I want to conclude by saying, and I want everybody to really understand this, I could speak just as long and just as sympathetically about the Palestinian perspective. Usually I don't just address the Jewish perspective. Usually I spend another 10 minutes then talking about the tragedy of the Palestinian experience, the tragedy of the Arab experience since colonialism. I really have done my best over the years to see both sides. And so I don't want anyone to think that just because I've talked about the Jews in this way, I sort of feel like we have a premium on suffering or being a victim.
Time.
Far from the case. I don't. I care about others too. But my assignment here today was to speak about Jews, which is what I've done, and I'm out of time. And I hope I've provided some insights into that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate that. So now we turn to Ayatollah Ahmad Yovani, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Before I go any further, I would like to thank all of those who made it possible for us to be here. In particular, my dear father and brother and colleague, Professor Wiseman. And it's my honor also to be before you, distinguished guests, seekers of truth. This panel, as you know, has two sessions. In the first session, we have been asked to address, and this is the question I'm reading for you, how best to understand why some sincere believers turn to extremism in the way they interpret their tradition. So I'll try to address this at the first session, and then in the second part, I'm going to offer some recommendation how we are going to address it, and what are the solutions and suggestions towards that. Now, radicalization is a complex social, psychological, and ideological process that people go through. A process that is not necessarily linear, nor does it inevitably end with the use of violence. However one define it, recognizing the process as one that varies case by case, and the persons involved are influenced and motivated by multiple long-term and near-term causes. Understanding the process is thus critical for everyone, for each of us, for policy prescriptions. Here are what I think should be taken into account in terms of conceptual clarification of the phenomena itself. First, radicalization, despite some similarities, ought to be seen not as a uniform process, but rather as somewhat different phenomena depending on the context and individual and communities. A particular reading of Islam is definitely the basis of the self-rediscovery of many extremists. To vast majority of the Muslim, this might be a distorted reading of the text, but for those who embrace it, it is an authentic and just version of Islam, guiding them to the desired objectives. And we are facing this as a fact. The line between radical and extremist view of Islam and one that actually condones violence is blurred. Not every radical reading of Islam expressing view, not every radical reading of Islam expressing views necessarily advocate violence. There are differences, what I can call instrumental and non-instrumental violent extremism. The difference is between those who are believers, advocate, or commit violence, and those who primarily engage in radical activities for self-interest, adventurism, occasions with radicals, association with radicals and extra. And usually those instrumentalist people mainly goes towards the leaders of these groups, that they have different agendas. But many people and young, motivated people who are going from different parts of the world and joining them, they are really believing this is the right way for them to defend Islam and seeking the truth and protect the values. Now let's go to the cause of extremism. The causes are both long-term and short-term. And here what I think the more important ones are: one, real and perceived injustice inflicted upon themselves or the broader Muslim community they feel affiliated with. The injustice are usually perpetrated by the local governments and by tacit or active support of external powers. No, that was number 2. Number 3, the cultural shift due to rapid globalization has put a lot of these young and vulnerable youth socially and culturally dislocated, resulting in identity flux that is subject to radicalization forces or individuals. Lack of economic opportunities and social mobilities that creates marginalization often compounds the cultural marginalization and make people more vulnerable. And sometimes intimidating counterterrorism and law enforcement measures could operate as mitigating factors, pushing radicals over the edge to violent actions. Now, let's go back to those people who are sincerely believing this is the right path for them, how they have come to that conclusion. Paying attention to all of those reasons I told you and I just referred to, there is another reason for that, and that's, the issue of radicalization is not something new. It goes back right immediately after the demise of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And that's also, is not also limited to Islam in particular. That's the issue related to any text that remain itself without having a right access to the founder of that text or to the author of that text. So then it is left to interpretation, and when the interpretation comes, then that's the problem starts. And especially in the history of Islam, anytime you see the downside or undermining of the rationality and the role of reason in the process of understanding Islam, you see the growing of that fundamentalism or radicalization within the Muslim communities. Now, if we go back to this last century, a few decades back, we see that there is a kind of ideology or very minor sector of Islam that has been supported by different countries and the oil money which has been coming from Saudi Arabia, that we are now familiar with that, a kind of Wahhabism, which we call it, a kind of very extremist Salafism that has been spreaded all around the world. Many of even American policymakers in the past especially, without careful studying of these facts and elements, just because they were close allies with, let's say, Saudis, they, without paying attention to the real essential of this ideology, they supported this kind of thinking all around the world. In Africa, in Asia, look at the Pakistan, those madrasas. And this kind of Wahhabism, there is no any room, if you go to their text, there is much less room for the intellect. They are trying to limit yourself and the tools of ijtihad to just taking you to the beginning of Islam, to the tradition of the companion or the Prophet himself, and they don't pay attention to the changes which is happening currently in the societies. So that's one of the reasons that these people are also being misguided, this young generation who are exposed to their media by, again, as I said, by loss of financial support, then it doesn't leave for them any time for reflection. As you know, even up to now, as far as I know, but someone can correct me, for example, studying philosophy or having philosophical books is forbidden in many of these Muslim countries, especially in Saudi Arabia. They have started in some universities some kind of reform, but still philosophy It's not been taught. It's forbidden. So these are the reasons that make these people, in addition of all other elements, to have that narrow-minded interpretation of religion that lead them to this kind of job and activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've just witnessed a piece of world history where a Washington panelist, an internationally renowned religious leader, gave back 10 seconds of his allotted time. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So we'll now pivot to Dr. Douglas Johnston. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. I'll take up his unused time. First of all, let me just say what a privilege it is to be here with so many gifted colleagues, good friends, but exceedingly bright friends. And I'm a little bit humbled. I'm outside of my comfort zone and what I'm going to talk about, because normally for the last 16 years I've been focused on conflict, and Islam was the interface for most of it. But I'm here to talk about Christian extremism, and very humbled by being in the presence of folks like Cardinal McCarrick, who have forgotten a lot more than I know. Anyway, no religion in the world is immune to the pull of extremism, and every religion has adherents who misrepresent the true meaning of the faith. Christianity is the most pervasive religion in the West, is no exception. Although we don't read much about it in the news, Christian extremism is a very real issue and no less dangerous than the extremism found within any other religion. As the leading faith tradition in most of the world's democracies, though, what is it that leads people toward extremism in Christianity? Like all religions, Christianity is subject to literal interpretations of the sacred texts. Those who rely on these strict interpretations for the practice of their faith are generally opposed to liberal theology or changes in cultural values and norms that point in the direction of secular humanism. Extremists, however, take it one step further in believing that their particular understanding of the truth is absolute, universal, and unchangeable. They tend to have a dualist view of the world, a world that is either black and white with no grays, or to say it differently, a world that is either good or evil with nothing in between. The fact that this worldview seemingly conforms to the dichotomies one finds throughout Christian scripture relating to God and Satan, heaven and hell, angels and demons, only serves to strengthen their convictions. The insecurity that comes from viewing the world in such narrow terms, however, leads the extremist to believe that his or her truth is the only truth and that it should be defended at all costs. Those who do not share their same view are seen as enemies of the faith, enemies not to be loved, but to be set straight, even if that requires a resort to force. To some extent, such an approach is not as foreign to our DNA as one might like to think. When the Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, long before we became a nation, they actively persecuted other groups like Quakers, Baptists, and others who believed differently than they. Among the heroes who fought against this to promote religious freedom were Roger Williams in Rhode Island and William Penn in Pennsylvania. Christian extremists also often misinterpret the very texts and teachings they believe they are protecting. A recent example was the purposeful distortion of Scripture that was resorted to by the Dutch Reformed Church in supporting apartheid in South Africa. Now, South Africa is a very religious country where more than 3/4 of the population attend church each Sunday. And there was no way that they could have subscribed to something as immoral as apartheid without justifying it through this sleight of hand with Scripture. Scriptures that reference violence, such as those found in the book of Revelations, can also serve as a misinterpreted source for why violence is deemed appropriate. And playing into the same mindset is a strong sense of self-righteousness, in which the extremists debunk those whose views don't coincide with their own. The attacks on abortion clinics, the killing of doctors who perform abortions, or the shooting up of Planned Parenthood centers by Christian extremists suggest that they also have a penchant toward lawlessness. Their understanding of God's law as the sole truth supersedes the law of man, and when man's law, i.e. pro-choice, marriage equality, and the like, seemingly run counter to God's law, they get upset and will sometimes resort to violence in the name of God to remedy what they see as an unlawful act, at least according to their spiritual standards. In the case of abortion, for example, they view the killing of doctors who perform this surgery not as murder, but as a defensive action against the willful killing of innocents created in the image of God. Another element that plays a significant role in why some Christians turn to extremism is propaganda. This can take many forms: radical sermons, the messages of Christian right-wing media outlets, and the like. And those with religious extremist tendencies will sometimes respond with violent behavior. Whether it's the Ku Klux Klan or the Aryan Nations, these Christian extremist groups use the power of propaganda to persuade others who share such leanings to take the next step and to use force to achieve them. In the second session, we'll go into some of the ways of coming at this. Particularly like to touch on Islamophobia, but let me just cap this off by making reference to a talk I gave at a church some months ago. It was to their congregation, and I opened by saying, you know, all of us here are Christians, and if we believed half of what we read or see in the media, we would conclude that Islam is our enemy. I said, well, what are we enjoined to do about our enemies? And what would that look like? And then I segued into talking about some of the work that our center does to try to bring reconciliation overseas. But this strikes the contrast between our religion, which has among its touchstones forgiveness and love your enemy, and this resort to extremism, which seems very, very incongruous indeed. And I look forward to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. I appreciate that. Dr. Subramanian, welcome.
Good morning.
Morning.
Namaste.
Namaste.
The term namaste is bowing to you, not just to you. The divine spirit in me bows to the divine spirit in you. And so that simply right there gives the concept, if in terms of how Hindus will hold in terms of all living and including non-living beings. But let me first of all thank Reverend James Weissman, Peter Kovac, and the Planning Committee, and Shaun Casey, and my apologies for coming late. I didn't realize the nuclear summit has got a phenomenal effect on the traffic, and so it just was a tough coming, in terms of it. I should have aimed for a much earlier coming, so my apologies. I also want to make sure, even though I am in an academic work, but I'm a professor of pediatrics, and so I'm not necessarily into the works of some of the scholars here, what they have done. But as a part of a practicing Hindu and teaching Hinduism at Georgetown to the medical school side, and as well as being involved in the Interfaith conference, I'm going to be giving my opinion about in terms of what I've been asked to address. Also, right up front, I need to say I will not be able to represent the 1 billion plus Hindus and the diaspora with their numerous paths and ways to do any full justice. So again, it'll be my personal opinion. And very quickly, to address in the first part, about the radicalization and reconciliation, it makes it very difficult to talk about. In fact, for me and the next speaker, in terms of Shante Uparatna, because our philosophies are quite different from the Abrahamic philosophies of the three religions that were addressed. And so trying to do it in the context of how the lens of what Abrahamic faiths look at, it's not going to be very helpful. And if I say it from the perspective of Eastern religions, it's even more complicated, because then I have to start giving a lecture on what the Eastern religion's all about and what their understanding is, and that makes it, within the 10 minutes impossible, to do at all. So I just wanted to keep that in mind and make myself available more to the questions that you might have in this tradition. Hinduism, even though it's popularly called that way, is not the name of the religion. In ancient times, for thousands of years, going back to 5,000 to 7,000 years of Rig Veda, it probably the people will know themselves as Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma is, in a short way, it's not the accurate translation, is eternal religion. Is one way to translate that. And the term Hinduism came about when invaders from Persia and Greek, came when they came near the river Sindhu, and they called the inhabitants around the area and further out as Hindus. And this place was also sometimes called Hindustan. And so that is how that name Hindus and Hinduism came. And since it's very common, I probably will use it interchangeably. I think as it was mentioned, when it was talked about Judaism, in India, over thousands of years, several invasions had taken place. As I mentioned, Persian, Greek, Islam, British, Dutch, French, Spanish, Portugal. I don't know why America never came. Everybody came. That's right. Give them some time. No, actually, I should say they were supporting us, during the independence, because we were fighting the British, and so they had some different way of looking at that. But there was so much invasion that was taking place. There is a certain amount of potential, for harboring intentions. But interestingly, I should say, India is probably one of the very few countries where for thousands of years, a lot of other religions, including Zoroastrians, who came from Persia many thousands of years ago, and Jewish people who came 2,000+ years ago, they said even before, and as well as subsequently Islam and Christianity, and the ingrown religions of Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism have lived together for thousands of years with respect and friendliness. And in fact, my understanding is, someone will correct me in terms of Israel's leadership, and the rabbinate has said India is the only country where Jews lived peacefully with no anti-Semitism at any time through the history of that land. So I think that is something tells you. And I'm just going to quote from the Interfaith Conference Executive Director, Rabbi Sirota, when he was in the Rumi Form discussion panel last year. He said, God intended different spiritual paths to exist and coexist. Interreligious understanding, then, is necessary for the reconciliation and coexistence. Hinduism fully subscribes to this view. And in fact, in their scripture, it says, Ekam Sat Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti. Ekam Sat, that means truth is one. Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti, that means the scholars, sages, seers speak it in different ways. And so the truth is still the one. There are different paths to the truth. And this has been the tradition that we have followed. And even today, you know, the concept of the several paths are acknowledged, and many of the founders, as well as the seers and sages of other religions, will be acknowledged also as consistent with those who show the way to the truth. And also, for again all these times, there has been no claims of exclusivity. I think that's usually is the origin of all the issues related to the conflicts that come, is once you start claiming yours is the only religion that shows the truth, there you go. You know, we are going to be in trouble. So this is something that you have to look at. How do we live, particularly in the 21st century and beyond, acknowledging the existence of others, and at the same time to be able to deal with, not just tolerate the other religions, but deal with respect to other religions, is the way to be able to look at that. If that doesn't take place, such radicalism was going to take place in all religions or any religion. I'm going to skip this whole, I had a, you know, since I'm a professor anyway, so I used to start with the definitions, you know. And so I'm going to skip the definitions. I'm going to assume all of you are very familiar with radicalism, extremism, violence, vandalism, and so on and so forth. But there is a reason I wanted to do that, but I will just skip that for now, and address in terms of where currently the potential for such radicalism or extremism could exist. There are three areas where, I'm not addressing the ancient times for how many? Yeah.
We're 10, but go ahead and finish.
Is simply, you know, for the first session, I'm going to focus on in the last, say, probably less than 100 years, is there are three categories of radicalism, if you want to look at that. One is the Maoist and Naxalite groups that have been a major issue in many states in India, and where the youths and individuals are radicalized. But this is not due to religion. This is more towards political ideology. And so I'm not going to be addressing that. The second is where there is an existence is in, even though in patchwork in many places, in Kashmir, there is, over the years, there has been development of conflicts between Muslims, Pandits, and Buddhists, you know, in the three major areas of Kashmir, Jammu, and Ladakh area, and where that is an issue which is of religious connotations, and that is, there are groups that are trying to attempt to reconcile, and we can address that in the second session. And then there is a whole bunch of incidences, is what I would call it, and both prominent in Indian and foreign press. It belongs to the category, if I had defined it, in terms of more vandalism and or retaliation to a provocation, and not necessarily sanctioned or approved by any scriptures in Hinduism of any violence of this nature. And so these are areas that it is potential for the conflicts and potential for radicalization, but we are probably talking in a different league than some of the other things that we are addressing in the current world, you know, at this stage. not necessarily every violence, vandalism is necessarily extremism or radicalism due to religion. But the press has got a tendency to blow that up, in terms of both Indian and foreign press, to make that fall on that category. Nonetheless, any acts of violence, murder, rape, destruction of property, or killing of innocent people, including women and children, are unacceptable regardless of how and who commits them, whether it is supported or not by any religious scripture, and in the Hindu scripture, for one, is not specifically, I can find anything to be able to pin down an articulation for violence on the basis of that. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Appreciate it. And finally, Bhante Katukastoda Uparatana, please. Thank you.
Namo Buddhaya. Good morning, friends, and Reverend James Wiseman and rest of the people who organized this thing, and our penalties, and respecting for them. I'm thankful to all of you and giving the opportunity to speak about Buddhist faith. And Buddhist faith is Dr. Sivasubralingam mentioned some part of the background. That's a wonderful thing. And the Buddha birth happened in Nepal, those days called India, but he birth happened in Lumbini, but he came to the India, and he enlightened in the Gaya, and he gave the first sermon in the Varanasi. And there's a peace thought he expressed from the 2,600 years ago. And he is not Abrahamic religious faith, and he's as a human being, birth happened, and he is not the prophet, but he is a founder of the Buddhism, the Siddhartha Gautama. He's a royalist, and his birth happened in the kingdom, and he had the luxurious life. He left the palace, and after his first son birth happened, same day the Rahula's birth happened, he left the palace, and he was looking for the solution for the suffering. And so, however, he lived in the 80 years, and as a Buddhahood, 45 years. Duration 45 years, he given the enormous peace teaching around that area. Buddhism is this Southeast Asian community, especially Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Laos, and Thailand, and Burma. These countries, it's a highly Theravada Buddhism. The Buddhists also have major 3 schools: Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism. So that's 3 kind of schools existing, and the duration of the Buddha's birth happened in India according to Brahmajala Sutra in Digha Nikaya. It was 62 religious on that time in the India, as Subramanya mentioned, and many faiths lived together many years without any trouble about the religious fighting and things. The Buddhism also, there was a peace message carry on, even though when the Buddha's passing away, the Parinibbana time, some radicals ask, who is our teacher going to be in the next? This is a wonderful answer. His teaching and his Dhamma and Vinaya, that's his Buddha's teaching, is that they are teacher. They're no leader. My teaching and my rules and Vinaya rules is your teacher. So that's why still, the Buddha's time, the Buddha recommend this kind of uniform and some other principles. We are carry on 2,600 years ago. This is a big organization, no any violence, they're trying to continue to spread the peace word. The karuna katanyuta loke. The Buddha says karuna is a compassionate. We are living with the compassionation, with the friendly manner and kindness to the ourselves and to the sharing with the whole world. This is the main, and karuna and wisdom. Both are emphasizing Buddhist teaching, and everything you can get the experience yourself. The Buddha just giving the instruction how to do. The Buddhist community called monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. That poor community, they have their own ethic, rules, and their practices. So monks and nuns, they're the rules and regulations they are teaching and passing to the future generation. And the laymen and laywomen are supporter. Monks are doing spiritual work. Monks and nuns, the lay people supporting, helping for the prevent the Buddhism and understanding Buddhism. They learn Buddhism, they practice in Buddhism. So this is a good coordination. However, the Buddhism these days were popular everywhere, Asia and Russia, even though and United States and Europe and Japan, Korea, China, everywhere. That's the name of the Buddhists, and they are practicing very peacefully. And among the Buddhism, according to this violation and kind of things they're talking about our topic today, even the Buddha's time, Buddha had a great enemy too. Buddha, not himself to spread the Dhamma, while he teaching his Dhamma, some jealous arise from the same community, like Devadatta, that's his cousin, and he want to kill Buddha and he want to become a Buddhahood. And for that purpose, he make so many violation thing, as he having robbed, and he have his own community at the other monks' community. He trying to show up, oh, I'm better than Buddha. I have this kind of rules. I'm not doing this, and the Buddha has the less discipline. I have more discipline. So that kind of way he trying to against the Buddha, his own relatives, but he tried to show up his because he's jealous, and that kind of thing happened. The Devadatta's activities, and not only for this Buddha's time, even the previous Bodhisattva's time also, he was his enemy, and as a result it happened. But however, and finally he realized, but one day he came to the monastery to respect to the Buddha, but he didn't get a chance, but he's going to be one day enlightened, but he will be because the Buddhists believe the heaven and hell. People do good thing, go to the heaven. People do the evil thing, they go to the hell. So this the thing, whatever you do with intention, you are responsible for it. So however, the Buddhists, not only the Buddha's time.
2 minutes.
And even though Kosambi, city of Kosambi, some monks, they had the struggle, and they were, some is talking, Dhamma is right, some monks are saying rules are right. They were arguing, they endless, they are not arguing, it's not endless. Then Buddha left them, he went to the forest. So that's kind of thing happening even in the Buddhism. And teaching of the Buddhism in the Hindu and Buddhist, the teaching, that's actually not Hindu, the Brahmanism. And the Buddha didn't change the Brahmanism, because the Brahmanism is whole India, is very popular. He just gave the new meaning for the what is he practicing about tree practicing. He recommended the worship the Bodhi tree, respecting Buddha as a Buddha and as a Bodhi. So that's kind of many differences he emphasized. And otherwise, and many other people who together, everybody work for the liberation from the sansaric suffering. That's the purpose. And he had the many enemies, your own rather than outside world. Anger, jealous, greediness, all kind of big enemy ourselves. The vimukti is even the Hindu religion is called vimukti, Buddhist religion is also called vimukti or nirvana, for the overcome to eradicate all the defilement or the greed, hatred, and delusion. That's our enemy. We are fighting for it, not fighting for the teaching, but the peace of the teaching is the vimukti. It's a peace teaching. It's not any complex, can expose any society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let's take a moment to thank our panelists. So we're going to take a brief break. I propose that we will be back in our seats by 10:30, ready to go.